And the third is tissues because you know what? I still get emotional about this sometimes. And I just usually follow up with a joke because it's, Jewish humor. But so I just kind of warn you about that. But I want to tell you how I came to write this story. And, um, a lot of the people, the tens of thousands I've spoken to, many are students. And the first thing I ask with them is how many of you are or were close with your grandparents? And many of them put their hands up. And my next question is how many of you would do anything your grandparents ask you to do? Now, really, what is it that grandparents want their grandchildren to do besides eat, right? I know that's true with my grandparents. Um, so a lot of people ask me, why did you write this book? There are so many books on the Holocaust. Why did you write it? And the answer is simple. My grandfather asked me to. So I grew up on Cape Cod in the 70s and 80s, and it was idyllic, especially compared to how my grandfather grew up in Poland in the 20s and 30s. Now, growing up, I didn't know about the Holocaust. I just thought it was this bad place. I had no idea really the details. And then in middle school, we read Night by Elie Wiesel, and I started to understand a little more about it, but I still didn't know how it related to my grandfather. Well, as a surprise to me, my mother came in and spoke to my class about what it was like to be a child of these survivors. And the things she was saying scared me. I wasn't really ready at that young age to hear these details, so I walked out. And it wasn't until a few years later, when I was in college, that I started to write and become a journalist, that I started to ask more questions. And upon asking questions, I learned that my maternal grandmother, the woman I was named after, didn't die of cancer as I'd been told, but she committed suicide. So when I found this out, I called the one person who I thought would be able to tell me why, and that was my grandfather. And, when I asked him, there was silence on the other end of the phone. My grandfather had never spoken about this before. They had been lying about it for decades, saying she died of cancer because at the time, suicide came with a stigma. Now, I don't know if it was because enough time had passed or because he and I were so close, but he did tell me why she committed suicide. But in order to do that, he had to first talk about another subject he never spoke about, and that was the Holocaust. And he told me what happened to my grandmother. She was born in Lodz, Poland, the youngest of 11 children. And at the beginning of the Holocaust, the town of Lodz became the Lodz ghetto, which is they barricaded this town. So that meant packages couldn't come in and out, food couldn't come in and out, medicine couldn't come in and out, and thousands died right away. And it also became a hub where they brought other people, and there were thousands of people in a small area. So many, many died. And at one point, while my grandmother was there, she was in a room with her oldest sister and the sister's twin boys. And two Nazis came in and they grabbed my grandmother's sister and they dragged her away. And she started screaming to my grandmother, promise you'll take care of my sons, promise nothing will happen to them. Now, my grandmother was an emaciated teenager. There was not much she could do, but of course she promised. I would have promised. I'm sure you would have as well. Well, the next day the Nazis returned, and this time they wanted the boys. And they took the boys, and my grandmother again tried to fight them, but there was nothing she could do. Well, my grandmother was left with a lot of guilt. And the next day the Nazis returned one more time, and this time they took my grandmother and they took her to a place called Auschwitz. Now, today, I don't really need to describe what Auschwitz is like because it's become synonymous with the Holocaust, right? 1.5 million Jews were murdered there. And my grandmother, when she arrived, she saw what happened to children. Kids ripped apart in tug of war, thrown into pits of fire. And I hate to even say that things like this happened 3 months ago on October 7th, but when my grandmother saw this, she realized that in order to survive, she was going to have to put this guilt that she felt way in the back of her mind because she had to focus every day on surviving. And somehow she did survive Auschwitz. She did survive a death march to Bergen-Belsen. And she survived the last few months in Bergen-Belsen until the camp was liberated and it became a displaced persons camp, a DP camp. Now, when you think that the war is over, you probably thought that the prisoners were excited. right? The war is over. But yes, they were relieved. But for many of them, they realized that they were the only ones in their family to have survived. After 4 or 5 years in horrible conditions, they had less than nothing. They barely had skin on their bones. And for many survivors, they said, look, I have no one, you have no one, let's get together. And my grandparents were introduced by a mutual friend, and they decided to get married. And about a year or so later, they were living in Regensburg, and my grandfather was starting a women's clothing business, and they had their first child, my mother. And when my mother was about one, some kids threw a rock in the window and they yelled, "Die, Jews." And my grandparents got very scared. They got scared that what had happened, which they could never have believed had happened, was going to happen again. And that's when they put in for visas to come to United States. And it took about a year, and they came, and they had no money and they had no language. But what they did have was the know-how on how to work hard, because they had survived. That's what kept them alive, was working hard. And so they worked and they saved. And eventually they were able to start, they opened a grocery business. And they had another child, a son, my Uncle Sidney. And during this time, they had a visitor. My grandmother's oldest sister had survived, and she had gone to Paris, and she came for a visit. And it was on this visit she said to my grandmother, "How come you didn't save my boys?" Now, was it a fair question? No. And that guilt that my grandmother had kept for so long just came rushing back. And can you imagine the worst things, and the guilt and all these feelings just came back. And, she fell into a big depression. They tried a lot of therapy with her, but nothing worked. And the doctor suggested another child, and she had another son, my Uncle Mark. And for a while, she seemed okay, but then it just proved too much, and she hanged herself. So my grandfather finishes telling me this story, and I'm just shocked. And I'm a writer now in college, and so I decide to write about my grandmother, and I write about her Holocaust experience, and I write about her suicide. And of all the feedback I got, the most significant was from my grandfather, who finally felt relief having unburdened himself from this secret. And he said to me, "I want to tell you my story. I want my children and my grandchildren to know how I survived by working hard and being lucky, but also why I survived." And the why is really the most significant part, because for 5 years, during 4 labor camps and 4 concentration camps where he was hungry and saw death every day, he never lost the belief and the hope of one day surviving and having a wife and replacing all those who were murdered. So my grandfather asked me to do this, and of course I said yes, because he hasn't ever asked me to do anything besides what? Eat, right? So of course I say yes. And I had no idea that it would take 18 years to complete, that it would eventually become a book, that it would be endorsed by Elie Wiesel and Yad Vashem, that it would be translated into Polish and sold around the world. At this point, all I was doing this as a gift for my grandfather, as a favor. So I was still in college, and when I graduated, like most college students, unsure what I wanted to do, I saw a woman on television who organized apartments and got paid for it. And I thought, I can do that in my sleep. So I said, I'm going to move to New York. I'm going to organize apartments. I'm going to live with my Uncle Mark in the Bronx. And my grandfather was in Brooklyn half the year, in Boca, Florida, where the Jewish grandparents moved to. And I could visit him and work on his story with him. So that's what I did. And I remember the first time my grandfather and I sat down together to work on his story. We were sitting on his beautiful screened-in porch, overlooking the water and the grass and birds. And I had a tape recorder. It's nice to talk to a group who remembers what a tape recorder is, and a pen and paper. And I said, okay, let's begin. And my grandfather opened his mouth, and then he closed it, and then he opened it again. He said, well, where do I begin? And I said, well, I don't know. I had never done this before. I said, well, what's the first thought to come to your mind? And without missing a beat, my grandfather told me about an experience that happened when he was in the Treblinka concentration camp. The Nazis came in and banged on their wooden cots with their batons and woke everyone up and made them all go outside and stand in a circle. Now it was freezing cold. They didn't have hats or jackets or boots or socks or anything, and they were standing in a circle, and there was a Jeep in the center of the circle. And all of a sudden, the circle opened, and a Nazi walked in to the center of the circle, and he had a Jewish prisoner whose hands were tied with a chain. And the Nazi held up an apple, and he said, "This Jew stole this apple from the mouth of a pig, but a Jew is no better than a pig." And he shoved the apple in the prisoner's mouth, and he shot the prisoner and tied him to the back of the Jeep, and they drove this prisoner in a circle within the circle where my grandfather was standing with the other prisoners. And my grandfather finishes telling me this story, and I think to myself, this memory has been bouncing around in his head for decades. You think of the worst thing that's happened to you, and you imagine that just coming to your mind like that. And I started to feel sad for my grandfather when all of a sudden his second memory was about being a child, growing up in his town in Stekashine and playing with his sisters and his brother and his cousins and riding his bike and playing soccer and having his bar mitzvah. And I was so thankful that my grandfather had this wonderful memory to tamper out these horrible ones. Now, little by little, my grandfather would remember more stories, and compare my grandfather's memory to that of a sponge. Because when you squeeze a sponge just a little and a few drops come out, and the more you squeeze, the more comes out. Well, my grandfather's memory was like that. So every time I'd go home and type it up and come back and reread it to him, he would remember a little more and a little more and make corrections. And there were moments when my grandfather was talking that his eyes would kind of glaze over. And he would not be sitting with me in Brooklyn or Boca, but he'd be back in Germany or Poland, and he'd be hungry and starving and seeing people killed. And there were many times he started to cry as we would talk. Now, I don't know if you had ever seen your grandfather cry, but it was a little unnerving. But I was in journalist mode, right? I would say, you woke up next to a corpse, then what happened? Or your father stepped out of line to get a sweater and they shot him, then what happened? And it really wasn't until I was home typing up my notes that I realized these were not facts you learn about in a history textbook. This was my grandfather's personal experience, and this was my family's history. And that's when, the tears started and they never really left. So over the years, my grandfather and I worked on this, and I, moved to New York, and I started other jobs, and I did other writing, and just in case I forgot that this was on my to-do list, my grandfather would call me up every once in a while and say, "So how's the book? I shouldn't be, I should be here. I want to read it. I'm not getting any younger." And I don't know if you've ever heard guilt, but that's what it sounds like. But I didn't take it as guilt. I took it as motivation, because this was the only thing my grandfather asked me to do besides what? Eat, right? It's great when a whole class yells, "Eat." Um, and I wanted to do this for him, but now that he was calling it a book, I felt like the pressure was on. How there are so many books on the Holocaust. How can I make this different from all the other books? And I had no idea how to do that. Well, in 2008, I got invited to a Jewish festival in Stekashtin in Poland, the town where my grandfather grew up. A lot of these little towns were having festivals to try to get the Jews to come back, because after the war, there was no way they didn't want to go back. And how can you blame them? And I said I was going to go back, and I told my grandfather, and he didn't want me to go. He said, "They're anti-Semitic, don't go." And I said, "Don't worry." That was his middle name. But, after what he went through, you can't blame him. So I go on this trip, and there are about 17 of us, and we've all got a relative from this town. And included on this trip was the first cousin of my grandfather's, who was actually from this town. And I remember we got off the bus, the poor town, and we were greeted by about 40 townspeople, blonde, blue-eyed, and they looked at us as though they had never seen Jewish people before, as though we were going to look different, right? So we begin a tour. And the tour is given in Polish, and then it's translated into English and Hebrew. So we can all understand because we're from New York and Israel. And so we go on this tour, and the first building we see is this beautiful building, but it's boarded up. And with no Jews in town, they're going to convert it into a mall. Okay, that's fine. That's fair. So we keep walking, and all of a sudden, my grandfather's cousin points out where my great grandfather's lumberyard business was. And I remembered stories my grandfather told me of walking to work with his dad and feeling so proud as a young boy and dreaming of one day walking with his son when the business was his, but we know that never happened. And the tour continues, and we come to the town hall in a big grassy field. And we're standing here and we're listening to the tour guide in Polish. And as we're listening, I'm thinking to myself, I wonder if my grandfather ever came here with his family on picnics. And as soon as I think this, the tour guide is translated, and it turns out that where we were standing was where my grandfather stood when he was chosen to go to the first of four labor camps and then four concentration camps. And it's where we were standing that my grandfather stood the last time he saw his family alive. He was about 18. So of course I'm getting a little choked up, and it was a sunny day, and now it's kind of getting overcast and gray, and the tour goes on, and the tour finally ends in front of restrooms. I was a tour guide at UMass Amherst. You would never stop a tour in front of restrooms. Why were we stopped here? What was the significance of these restrooms? Well, it turns out that before these restrooms were here, it was the Jewish cemetery. And the new mayor in town said, well, we need public restrooms. Where could we put them? And of all the places they could have put them, we just walked. They could have been put anywhere. Why right here? And it turns out, in order to put up these restrooms, they had to dig up all the remains and they threw them away. And they took all the headstones and they turned them into somebody's backyard patio. So as I'm hearing this, my hands are balling up into fists. I'm angry. And my eyes are filling with tears because I'm sad. And I look around at our group, and you can't tell who's who. Polish, Jewish, everybody is hugging. They've got arms around each other. They're lighting candles, and it's starting to drizzle. And it was at that moment I realized what had been missing from my grandfather's book. Now, all this time, I thought I was writing this book for my grandfather, but I wasn't. I was writing it for me. For my sisters, for my nieces, for my nephew, my cousins, for my family, for the tens of thousands of people who've read the book, and knock on wood, the tens of thousands more who will read it. Because this is a story we cannot forget. The story is one man's story, but it represents 6 million other stories of those who died who couldn't tell their story. It signifies that we cannot forget this story, that we have to keep remembering, because it tells us what happens when hatred gets out of hand. So I left Poland determined to finish my grandfather's book. Now, at the time, I was the chief of staff to the president of Hunter College, and I worked 20 hours a day. I mean, my life was crazy. I was writing a column. I had no time to breathe, and I thought, there's no way I can finish this book. I have to quit my job. So I said, in order to do that, I need to find an apartment that I can afford and give myself 1 year to finish writing this book. And I found it through a friend, a tiny apartment, very tiny apartment. And I moved in and I quit my job. Now I was still writing for a newspaper, and they found out I lived in a small apartment, and they asked me to write an article about how to organize a small apartment because I'm also an organizer, and I did. And, I was in that apartment a year, another year. I stayed in that apartment for 5 years. And during that time, I loved it because my lifestyle had changed. And I was just finishing the book when I got an email from a woman who made videos of tiny apartments around the world. She wanted to make a video of my apartment. I said, sure. And she came over one day. In an hour and a half, she got all the footage she needed. And just so happens the cover of my grandfather's book was up on my computer, and that got into the video, which I didn't know. Well, a month or so later, my book came out and it sold 150 copies. And I was thrilled because I never expected to sell one copy. I wrote it just as a gift for my grandfather. Well, a month or so later, I get an email from the videographer that the video has 47,000 views. And I thought, I didn't know my mother had that many friends, right? Wow. So that was amazing. So a couple months later, the video wound up on the homepage of Yahoo, where in one day it got almost 1.5 million views. And from there, it just skyrocketed. Suddenly, I was getting interview requests from around the world on TV and radio and print, everything, and emails from strangers around the world saying they saw my video and where could they find a tiny apartment. But after a while, the emails I got from people said, "Hey, I saw your video. I bought your book. Your grandfather is a hero." And as soon as I got emails like that, I would call my grandfather up and read them to him over the phone. And you could hear him smiling through the phone because it validated for him that he's not only survived for a reason, but let himself go through how hard it was to retell his story, which was almost like surviving it again. And for many survivors, they couldn't relive it. They couldn't think about it, like my grandmother, and they took their own lives. But my grandfather was the strongest person I knew. And so I was thrilled that I was getting all this. And my grandfather loved the stock market. He would watch that ticker, and now he would call me every week and say, "How many books did we sell this week?" And he would love to hear the numbers. I mean, it blew us away. This little project we'd been working on for so long had a life of its own. I moved into that tiny apartment so I could work on that book, and it turned out that that tiny apartment helped sell his book around the world. Now, of the millions who've seen the video, there's one person I never thought would see it, and that was the landlord of that tiny apartment. It turns out I was illegally subletting, and I had no idea. You get a good deal in New York City. I was paying $700 a month for the Upper West Side. In New York City, that's like free. So anyways, we all go to housing court and we negotiate, and they said, "You can stay 5 more months, but you have to find another place to live." And I started looking, and all the other places were larger and more money, which meant that my lifestyle was going to have to change again. I was going to have to get a crazy job to pay a crazy rent for space I didn't need. But meanwhile, my grandfather's book was selling and doing so well, I was getting asked to speak around the country. And I started traveling around the US in between looking for a new place. And one week I had 4 talks down in Florida. And these are my favorite because I had a guest speaker with me, and that was my grandfather. And he was about 91. And the very first talk we did was to 200 fifth graders. And we walked in, he had his walker, and we get to the front, and these kids sat silently listening to every word he said, which wasn't easy. He still had an accent, and he was older. His voice was frail. When we finished speaking, the kids ran up to him. They high-fived him. They fist bumped. They hugged him. They wanted their photos taken with him. You couldn't get the smile off my grandfather's face. And in fact, when the Facebook memories pop up, it was 10 years ago today that we spoke at a school. So it was nice to see those photos again. When we left, we forgot the walker. I had to go back and get it. He floated out of that school. It was unbelievable. It was like, a miracle. It was amazing. So I come back and I'm helping him in the car, and I'm leaning over him, putting his seatbelt on him. He takes my face in his hands and he says, "Honey, we did something good." So one night during that trip, we're sitting in the kitchen eating ice cream, because of course that's what you do. And I'm telling him about my issue with housing and an apartment and rentals. And he said, I think you should buy an apartment. I think it's time." And he said, "I'm going to give you the down payment." And of course, I start crying. And he reaches over, takes my hand. He says, "You lived in a shoebox so you could write about my life. And now I want to help you enjoy yours." So I go back to New York. And the first place I found, I fell in love with. It was 2 blocks from my tiny apartment. It was 5 times bigger, which isn't saying much since the tiny apartment was 90 square feet. But I fell in love with it. It had doorman, had lots of windows. And I ended up moving in a couple months later. And the newspaper came back, the Daily News, the Post, they all wanted to kind of cover the story since it had been so big. And after everyone left, the first person I called was my grandfather to thank him. And here's the choke up. And so he said, buy yourself a nice couch, enjoy your life. That was kind of what he wanted me to do. And it's why I keep telling the story. It's why I keep speaking. It's why I was training other grandchildren of survivors to how to tell their story and to go into schools, because we have to keep talking about it. As hard as it is, it's not easy to tell the story. It's not easy to talk about my grandfather, but it's so important. So, when Meg contacted me, of course I wanted to come and speak. And I've given this talk so many times, and I hope to keep doing it. And I have a niece who's 19 and a nephew who's 16, and I tell them that one day they'll be doing this talk. And I hope they will, to keep this story going. And it's not easy, but I'm happy to keep doing it. And I would love to, open this up to discussions, questions, thoughts. Again, thank you. Thank you for coming and listening.
If anybody has any questions or comments for Felice, please feel free to unmute yourselves and we can chat a little bit. Thank you so much. That was really wonderful.
Hi, Felice, it's Vicky.
Hi.
We share the same last name.
Cousins.
Probably, although my family came from more of the Polish-Russian border, which kept shifting constantly, but I figured out it was probably more Belarus. Yeah, your story was beautifully written and poignant, and I really appreciate it that you did it. My grandparents are both gone, and they had very interesting stories, very different, because my grandparents both left Europe just before it got really bad. So they left. My grandmother and her entire family survived. My grandfather, only he and his brother and his rest of his family perished in the Holocaust. So they had different stories to tell. And I did spend some time with my grandfather with audio tapes. And I do have some writings that he wrote. And I have an entire box of Yiddish letters that he wrote back and forth to Europe and to I mean, it's an incredible story, which I am, struggling to put together because I feel like it should be told. Quite different from yours, but equally, with so much trauma and tragedy, having to live through a period of time where, your whole world basically goes up in flames. So thank you. That was really, really something.
Thank you. I love the idea of the letters. My next book that I'm working on now is letters. I was little, but letters are so poignant, and in Yiddish too. I mean, it's such a beautiful language. It's almost like music. So that would
I found a translator who did some for me. So I've kind of got some of it translated, which is just remarkable. Yeah, I learned Yiddish as a child. I never went to Hebrew school, but they sent me to Workman Circle Yiddish. So I actually knew Yiddish, and I could talk with my grandparents to a certain extent. I don't remember much now, but yeah, it's a beautiful language.
Well, that's great. I know my parents still speak it sometimes.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you for coming too.
So Felice,
Hi.
Hi, I'm Tony. Your story was really moving, and I'm so glad that I could hear it. One of the things that concerns me is, as the years go by and there are fewer and fewer survivors, that it's not just that these stories get lost, but that it's been going on 100 years, since the 1930s, and that we lose sight that this didn't all happen just all of a sudden out of nowhere in the 40s. And we lose sight of what built up to it. And I know there's concern. I know there's a lot written. I know people are talking about that. But the fascism that built up to it, that allowed it to even happen, I feel people get very concerned that they're going to lose these memories and lose this reality that it did really exist. I know I have a friend who wanted to try to institute a Seder, a Holocaust Seder. So the concept being it would go on. But you say you've had a lot of good reception for your book, obviously. What would have happened if that photographer hadn't shown up in your apartment?
It just would have probably been shared with the family, the
Yeah.
book. It's,
So it just makes me think of how many more stories there are.
yeah.
And when you continue to talk about it, you find a good reception. Good, that's a terrible word. You find a reception and people care and they're interested. Does anything happen next? Like Vicky was saying, it encourages her to want to publish her own. Do you find that that's people take action, or it's just, oh yeah, it's another story?
No, I think, I wrote this for my grandfather. I didn't write it to think I was going to sell it or speak or do all these things. And, especially when I speak in schools, especially in New York City, where kids are from every country, where we don't know the stories, they don't know their stories. I encourage them to speak to their parents, to ask their aunts and uncles and grandparents how they got to this country. And yes, the focus, if I can, other Jewish students to talk about to their families, or like Vicky, their uncles, their grandparents, their whatever relatives, to find out these stories. But like most of us, how did we get here? And I think it's important for us to know our history. And especially now, like you're saying, with what's going on in Israel, what's going on here in the United States in these colleges, we need to keep talking about this. It's not easy to talk about. It's, you want to hide, you don't want to hear about this. um there's a saying in Yiddish, "Beshert" means it was meant to be. And I'm so thankful that I moved into that tiny apartment. And when we talk about things that are not easy to talk about or that are hard, I think we grow from that. And whether nothing ever happened with this book as it did, I knew for my grandfather how important it was for him to tell his story. He had never spoken about it. So I think for people who've gone through whatever trauma, to talk about it, to write about it. My latest book, a memoir, was something I was I felt shame about for so long. And now that the book has come out, it was like this release. And it was nothing like the Holocaust or any horrific thing like that. But it's important that we get this stuff out, that we talk about it, for whatever. So, I mean, that's all I can encourage. I'm also a volunteer with Self-Help, and they started after the war raising money for survivors. And there are still about, I think, 10,000 Holocaust survivors in New York City. And a lot of them are hurting, and they need money and they need funds, and we can help right away. But, they're still with their memories. And so that can't be easy, but that's hard.
Felice, have you seen an uptick in being in speaking engagements recently? Because your book came out a while ago, right?
It did. What's interesting is I had scheduled from last spring a couple talks this past fall. And one was like not even 2 weeks after October 7th. So it was on Cape Cod, and we had a huge group. And there were a lot of non-Jews. People just were concerned about what was going on, and they wanted to hear the story. And I was happy to give it. That was a tough one. I think that was really hard because, like I said, we talk about, we say never again, and now they're saying never again is now because, yes, we're concerned with what's going on in Israel, but concerned here as well. What is going on? It's scary. It's scary what's happening, because it was scary in the 30s in Poland, and there was talk and people were like, that could never happen. We think we're this modern society.
Well, the Germans said the same thing. Oh, this could never happen to us. I'm a World War I hero.
Right. Right. Exactly. Karen, did you just raise your hand?
I did. Hi, I'm Karen, and
Hi, Karen.
one side of my parents were from Germany and Austria, who came here during the war, And my grandmother on one side of the family actually wrote her memoirs. Actually, I was curious if we're related way back because they have Cohen with Kohn, but since all the spellings were always changed. But yeah, so the one side of the family did talk about it. The other, my father's side did not talk about what happened to them at all leaving Austria as it was being annexed. But the other thing that struck me was just my grandmother did it actually, she wrote it for her grandchildren so that we would have the story and you know how many people were lost, but how it built up. And when my parents settled here, they met here. They when the McCarthy hearings started, they bought their first TV because they thought, wait a minute, this can't happen here. Can it happen here? I'm glad they're not around now. But yeah, they would be pretty scared.
Yeah. I know when these things happen, I just think I'm glad my grandfather isn't here to see this stuff. But when we would speak, he would always end by saying, God bless America.
Yeah.
But yeah.
But so thank you. This was interesting. Mhm.
Dan, did you want to share something?
Oh,
Let's
Yeah,
see if I-
Barbara's husband. I recently went to Lithuania, where three of my grandparents were from, and went to Kovna, and a town outside where, very bad things happen. And I always thought, great appreciation to my grandparents. My grandfather left at 16 and his brother 16 and 17. They were young boys. But when I got there and I looked at the ghetto and the place where they lived, the great appreciation should be expressed to their parents, knowing that they're sending two boys to the United States that they would probably never see again. And the situation there was so bad. I mean, it's true that the Holocaust is something that is just hard to comprehend in the enormity and gravity of what the situation. But there was suffering going on for years, for years. So in the early 1900s, here these families are sacrificing or sending their children to the States saying, there's nothing here for you. Nothing here for you. You've got to go. And here he was, a 16-year-old kid coming to the States, not speaking any English and trying to make a life for himself and never see his parents again. So I had such great appreciation for these people that I really obviously didn't know. And what they were willing to sacrifice for the betterment of the kids and for their grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And I feel such great appreciation for what they did, So it was quite a moving experience for me. And I went with my 40-year-old daughter who wanted to see her roots. And, we managed to be able to say prayers at appropriate places. And it was a very moving experience. So, but I really appreciate your talk, and it was very moving. And my grandparents just never talked about the relatives that were lost, and I know some were lost from looking at the records. Yeah, they
yeah.
just wouldn't talk about it.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah. I mean, horrible stories of what people have gone through.
Yeah, I was just, I wanted to share, Dan, that what you were saying about how bad it was in Europe, and in a similar vein, my grandfather and his brother left before, I guess it was probably early 30s. But because there was just no future there, my grandfather would talk about the pogroms that were constant with the Polish, coming across the border, back and forth, and just beating everybody up. And it was a continuous situation. So this was, a constant that they lived with, the fear of being terrorized by their anti-Semitic neighbors.
Right, right.
Felice, something that I thought was really interesting from the beginning of your book was that your grandfather hadn't shared his story before he chose to share it with you, right? So you were really the first one.
Yeah, I was the first one. I know we were speaking before we began about, grandparents didn't want to, or these survivors didn't want to burden their children, right? And they came to the States or wherever they moved to. The kids didn't want to hear about it. They wanted to assimilate. They wanted to be American, and parents didn't want to burden their kids. But I think with grandparents and grandchildren, there's like this buffer in between. And grandchildren, we see our grandparents and we want to ask questions. And I think that it was easier to ask questions. We weren't so fearful of it. And I was really the first to ask my grandfather anything. And of all the grandchildren, I've really been the one to ask these questions. I think it's so important that we tell these stories and we keep our history going and to know this stuff. My grandfather died, he was 94, and there were a couple days before he died, and he was emaciated and tiny, and he was in bed, and we gave him the remote control to hold, and he just raised it, and he hadn't been speaking, and all of a sudden he just said, "My granddaughter wrote a book." And we all just like started bawling. I mean, it was just because he was so proud of this, and he would go up to everybody. He was, the PR marketing guy, and he would say, "Do you have internet? Buy my book." And it was so great this, to hear him and to talk about this with him, and it really made us closer. We had a special bond. So I was lucky. April, you got to unmute.
There, okay. Sorry, I have a little laryngitis, so it probably sounds like I'm still on mute. So I'll do the best I can. But your story about how you first heard about the horrors when you were, how old were you, did you say?
I was in middle school.
Okay, so when I was 14, both my parents are American born. My grandparents are European. When I was 14 and I came home from school and I just was poking around old photo albums. Both my parents worked at that point. I found an album that my dad had made during World War II. He enlisted at 18 and was in the Army Corps of Engineers. And he took hundreds of photographs and he very carefully annotated everything. But I got to a point in the book, my father, I knew nothing. I had never heard of the Holocaust. I was 14. My father never talked about it. And I got to a point in the album where I just saw photos that he had taken of thousands of bodies piled up. My father was a liberator at Dachau. And I was really traumatized when I saw the pictures. It was terrifying. I never saw anything like that in my life. It was horrible. And when my dad came home, I asked him about it. He didn't go into great detail. And he used to tell us all kinds of great stories from the war. He was shipped out to Algeria. And then he crossed the Mediterranean up through France, across the Rhine into Germany, blah, blah, blah. But he would never talk about that part of the story. And our sons, who are now 25 and 31, went to Jewish day school on the Upper West Side. And they had to do, in middle school, they had to do a Holocaust project. And they asked their teacher if they could interview, I'm really sorry, their grandfather, who was not a survivor, but was a liberator and fought in the war as a Jewish GI, who had been told he could trade in his dog tags so it didn't have an H on it because Jewish prisoners of war were not treated like other prisoners of war, blah, blah, blah. And that was the first time I really heard about Dachau from my father, because he sat down and allowed himself to be interviewed by each of my sons at, when they were in 7th or 8th grade, which was pretty much the age I found out about it. And that was the first time he talked about it. And It was the first, I was very, very close to him. It was really the only time in my entire life I saw him get choked up. I mean, he was one of these sort of, he was very loving and wonderful, but like he was tough. Like he, you know, he was orphaned. His dad died when he was 11. Like he went through a lot in his life, but I never saw him react like that about anything. But I'm lucky that I have this album, which I scanned in photo by photo, page by page, and I had a book made of it just for my family, although a digital copy is in the Holocaust Museum. And on my father's first yard site, which happened to fall on Yom HaShoah, which is really crazy. I mean, it falls either the day of or day before, you know, every year. But on his first yard site, I made a presentation to the Friday morning tefillah group at the school. My kids went to the Abraham Joshua Heschel School, which if you're a West Sider, you probably heard of it. And I made, you know, I mean, I toned, you know, made it age appropriate, but like you were saying, like I would have, you know, we lived near the school and I would be walking down Broadway and sometimes parents would stop me and say, oh, my son or daughter is still talking about your father's war stories. And it was obviously very gratifying for me, but I wouldn't say most, but many of us have these very personal, intense stories. So I'm glad I have it, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's remarkable to have all those photos. That's incredible.
I also have a set of Baccarat crystal that was part of a 500-piece collection being made for Hermann Goering when my father's platoon liberated the Baccarat factory.
Wow.
And yeah, so we often make l'chaims with it, just for the hell of it.
Yeah,
Anyway,
smart.
thank you for your stories. It's really important that people keep sharing them.
Thank you for sharing.
Hi, Meg.
Hi, April. Nice to see you.
You too.
Does anybody else want to share before we close for the evening? Thank you very much for being here. Thank you so much, Felice. This was a really moving, important evening, and I really appreciate you sharing with us.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you for having me, and thank you all for coming. I appreciate it.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.